February is Black History Month, and so a lot of schools decide to teach specific curriculum for this month, which is completely fine. But other schools take it way too far, like this school district in Ames, Iowa. They decided to teach Black Lives Matter for children. They are essentially teaching propaganda and passing it off as fact in lieu of Black History Month. So here, we're going to look at the 13 points they talk about in this curriculum, but I also want to look at Black Lives Matter as a whole, because the organization has some very recent demands that are amusing, but also somewhat terrifying. So you don't want to miss that. Stay tuned till the end. So this is the Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action, which was last week in Ames, Iowa. We're going to skip the introduction because ain't nobody got time for that. And we're going to look just at the 13 points they talk about, or the guiding principles. The first one is restorative justice. And they say, we are committed to collectively, lovingly, and courageously working vigorously for freedom and justice for Black people, and by extension, all people. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, except for perhaps the implication that Black people don't currently have freedom or justice. And I know you can make arguments about the justice system and do that if you want, but in my mind at least, it kind of propagates the myth that Black people are targeted time and time again just for being Black, and that you are at danger of dying on the street every single day because you're Black. And the data just doesn't back that up. That's not to say there is not discrimination, because obviously there is, but widespread discrimination that necessitates you say you don't have freedom or justice, well, I don't agree with that. Now, we'll look at empathy. And again, there's nothing wrong with empathy, but I want to highlight one very important word that they use here. And that is when they say, we engage comrades. Now, why is that important? Well, because Black Lives Matter has, I say, a history of being called a Marxist organization. And that's because one of the co-founders said that they were trained Marxists. So it kind of makes sense that you're called a Marxist organization if one of your co-founders admits that they were in fact a Marxist. So Black Lives Matter have been trying to, avoid that label because no one likes it. But here you have a curriculum using that exact phrase, comrades, which doesn't necessarily mean Marxism. But when someone says comrade, your mind kind of goes to Soviet Russia or communism, which is, linked to Marxism. So it's not necessarily the best move here. And granted, this is by the Ames, Iowa school district. It's not related to Black Lives Matter, but they do use Black Lives Matter terminology. So if we keep going to talk about loving engagement, diversity, and globalism, I want to read about this one a little bit. It says, we see ourselves as a part of the global Black family, and we are aware of the different ways we are impacted or privileged as Black folk who exist in different parts of the world. So you've heard of white privilege? Well, now, at least in some instances, we do have Black privilege. But point 6 is where we get into the really interesting stuff that's not really relevant to Black History Month, I guess, at all. So queer affirming. We are committed to fostering a queer affirming network. Where we gather, we do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, or rather the belief that all in the world are heterosexual unless he or she disclose otherwise. Now, I want to point out here, in that queer affirming statement, they only used 2 pronouns, he and she. So what about the Z's or the theirs or the any other number of pronouns? There's 70 of them according to Facebook or something like that. So that is very not queer affirming because you only included those who are he or she. So what's up with that, Black Lives Matter? Come on. And then we have trans affirming, which is basically the same thing. And then we have collective value. So I want to read this one. We are guided by the fact that all Black lives matter. Well, I agree with that. Regardless of actual or perceived sexual identity, gender expression, economic status, ability, disability, religious beliefs or disbeliefs, immigration status, or location. Now, no one disagrees with any of that. Everyone does believe that Black lives do in fact matter. I don't agree with Black Lives Matter as an organization for a number of reasons. But why is it a collective value? Shouldn't it be an individual value? You don't have more value because of your collective identity. It's because of who you are as an individual. So I'm not entirely sure with collective value here. If you understand why this is a collective value and not an individual value, then go ahead and let me know in the comment section down below. And this is a good time to point out that you should just comment anything in the comment section below because it'll help out the algorithm. So just at this point in time, just type in whatever you want down below. Keep it kind of nice, but just comment something. So they also have intergenerational, and then Black families. I want to talk about that and Black villages. So 11 says that we are committed to disrupting the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages. So this is something that was on the Black Lives Matter website itself. talking about disrupting the nuclear family, or the Western prescribed nuclear family, which is absurd because it's not a Western ideology to have a nuclear family. It's not specific to the West by any means. You can look at many other countries, including Japan, who I believe has a much higher rate of a mother and father than we do even in America. So it's not Western prescribed to begin with. Why do you want to disrupt something that is, by all data, one of the best ways that a child can grow up? Are you so upset about a Western nuclear family that you want to disrupt it and harm the children who are part of it? Now, that's not to say that every family is going to be a nuclear family, because obviously it won't. But that is something to strive for, and if it's something that you have, why should it be disrupted? And yes, you should have extended family and they should support you and all of those things. I'm not disagreeing with any of it. But my problem here is the terminology. Why disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family when it is, statistically speaking, pretty much the best sort of family that you can have? I just don't understand that. They also say, point number 12, they are unapologetically black in our positioning. In affirming that Black Lives Matter, we need not qualify our position. But they kind of already are here. To love and desire freedom and justice for ourselves is a necessary prerequisite for wanting the same for others. And I have no problem with that. My problem here is that if I were to say I am unapologetically white, well then that's just white supremacist and I'm just showing my white privilege. So, there's that. And then 13. We are committed to building a black women affirming space free from sexism, misogyny, and male-centeredness. Now, as we scroll back through these points, we see that they are affirming for black women, and they are trans affirming, and queer affirming, and globalist, but where are the black men? They don't really talk about the black men at all. So are they just being pushed to the side? Because even if you're a black male, you still have male privilege, so you're not important enough to talk about, I suppose. So these are things that are being taught in the Ames school district. But some of these things aren't really able to be taught to children because they're a little bit too in-depth. So thankfully, the school district has this folder of resources. So we're going to look at how they translate those 13 principles to elementary school. Here we can see the kid-friendly version of the 13 principles. And it's basically all the same information, but it's in different ways. So if we look at trans affirming, this one I just thought was a little bit funny the way it was worded. Everybody has the right to choose their own gender by listening to their own heart and mind. Everyone gets to choose if they are a boy or a girl, or both, or neither, or something else. And no one gets to choose for them. So your options are a boy, a girl, both, neither, something else entirely. And I feel like neither kind of fits with the something else entirely, but they're trying to be very inclusive here. And then it has the same thing about queer affirming. And then collective value, it says everybody is important and has the right to be safe and happy. But again, why is that as a collective? It should be an individual value because everybody is important. Not every group of people is important. Those are two very different things, in my opinion. And then they talk about there are lots of different kinds of families and we need to be nice to them and all those things. So I guess they kind of took that same propaganda and they watered it down a little bit to make it seem a little bit more acceptable. But this is still not something that I think they should be teaching to children, let alone in Black History Month. I feel like Black History Month should be teaching about Black history, not about how Black Lives Matter is queer and trans affirming and unapologetically Black. That's not the same thing by any stretch of the imagination. But Black Lives Matter is kind of a Marxist organization. We've already talked about that, but they are pretty ridiculous. So now let's go ahead and look at the demands that they have for us, I guess, as an organization. So on their official website, they have this very big box here saying that we want to end white supremacy, which sounds fine to me. And apparently I can do that by just supporting any demands that Black Lives Matter has. So let's click on it and see what it is. And as a side note, whenever an organization like Black Lives Matter or whatever it is says they have a list of demands, my first reaction is to ignore them. Because who are you to demand anything of me? You should have a list of requests or questions or anything like that, but a demand is so powerful, they're demanding I take this specific action, and I'm not about that. So let's just look at the demands. There are 7 of them. And by co-signing this, we can end white supremacy. So we have to do it, right? If you want to end white supremacy, you must agree to all of these things. The first one is very important. We must convict and ban Trump from future public office, because that will end white supremacy. Am I right? We also have to expel any Republican members of Congress who attempted to overturn the election and incited a white supremacist attack. And I love how they're doing this, where they talk about the Capitol riot is by necessity a white supremacist attack. And sure, I'm sure there were some white supremacists in there, and there were a lot of crazy people because they attacked the Capitol, but let's not pretend that all of it is solely based on white supremacy. It's a little bit ridiculous to say that, in my opinion. Here, they want to just keep going with this. They want to launch a full investigation into the ties between white supremacy and the Capitol Police, law enforcement, and the military, saying that police departments are a safe haven for white supremacists to hide behind a badge, because, cops and white supremacy is basically the exact same thing. We also need to ban Trump from all digital media platforms. Now, this one stands out to me a little bit because if you look at the other points, and we'll look at the last two in a little bit, the last three rather, most of them have to do with politics or local government in some way. And here we have banning Trump from digital media. So does that mean they want the government to go through and forcibly remove Trump from these organizations or from these platforms? I hope not, because that would be a huge overreach of government. So maybe this is specifically for the social media platforms, but either way, not a fan of this. And then they're stereotypical because you always have to say this if you agree with Black Lives Matter. We must defund the police. And then point 6, this is the one that I really like, and I think it's truly indicative of what they believe. So we can't let the coup be an excuse to crack down on the Black Lives Matter movement. So they're talking about the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2021, which is being talked about because of what we saw at the Capitol, which is understandable. But they say that these laws are used to target black and brown communities for heightened surveillance, and that Republicans are already trying to create an equivalence between the mob on January 6th and our Freedom Summer. So let me emphasize that one more time. This January 6th riot was a mob, that's understandable, but what we saw for months over the summer was not a mob, it wasn't a riot, it was a Freedom Summer. That's all it was. If you disagree with that, then you are a white supremacist racist. Now, I do want to point out that Freedom Summer, as they're calling it, is costing somewhere between $1 to $2 billion in insurance claims, and significantly more than that because not everyone is going to make an insurance claim. So it's probably more than $2 billion of damage, and that's just a Freedom Summer. These are the types of beliefs that are being taught to our children, I suppose. And the last thing we need to do is pass the Breathe Act, because police were born out of slave patrols, and we cannot reform an institution built upon white supremacy. So whenever you hear people say defund the police, and then they say, well, that actually doesn't mean defund the police, it just means change their funding. Look at Black Lives Matter as an organization who want to defund the police because they say that we cannot reform an institution built upon white supremacy. To me, that phrase doesn't sound like just changing the funding a little bit. It sounds like completely getting rid of police entirely. Because after all, they're built upon white supremacy and they can't be reformed. Why try to reform it? You might as well just discard it entirely. All of this is why I don't support Black Lives Matter. Now, Black lives do in fact matter. I'm not disagreeing with that, and no one is. But when you say Black Lives Matter, you don't really mean that independently every Black life matters. What you mean is this. These demands, this absurdity that I think most people actually wouldn't agree with if they sit down and look at it. The problem is it's such a loaded term. If someone says Black Lives Matter and my response is negative, then I must be racist because for some reason I wouldn't think Black Lives Matter. But that's not the case whatsoever. It's just a way to paint anyone who opposes their Freedom Summer in a negative way, which is, ridiculous, but that's how it goes. Now I recognize that Ames, Iowa is not a particularly large place, and we just looked at one school district. But there are other districts and there are other teachers who are more than willing to teach this propaganda to your children. So if you're a parent and have students in a public school, make sure you know what type of information they're receiving. Because in some cases, instead of teaching Black History Month, which they should do, they teach something like Black Lives Matter, which is a political ideology and is not really related to Black History Month. Yes, they both relate to Black individuals, I suppose, but Black History Month is something that is nonpartisan. Black Lives Matter is completely partisan. All you have to do is look at their political beliefs and ideology, and that becomes evident. Anyway, thank you for watching, sharing, and subscribing. Don't forget to leave a like and make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.